Anybody read the book, by the way?
I bought the book.
You bought it?
And I'm
She's read it. You read chapter 1. Highly recommended book. Huh?
Already I have questions.
You already have questions?
Yes, but you're going to
Okay,
answer them.
I'm going to answer them. We'll see. So tonight we're talking about how Judaism and Christianity became two separate religions. It is a common misconception that if you ask people, where did Christianity come from? Most people will tell you it came out of Judaism. And this is a misconception. Rabbinic Judaism, modern day Judaism, and Christianity basically came out of what we would call Second Temple Judaism. I'll explain that more in a moment. So they're really more like siblings than mother-daughter religions. People who recognize them as being siblings will tell you quite often, this was actually the party line by many scholars until maybe the last 50, 60 years, was that they are sibling religions. And where the split occurred was after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Does anybody know what the Bar Kokhba rebellion is? So there were 3 Jewish revolts against the Roman Empire. The first one was in 70 AD, and this was when the temple was destroyed. But there were 2 after that. And in 132 AD, there was is this your lost friend?
Yeah, it's one lost friend.
Come in, lost friend.
I have another lost friend coming in.
Found the right place.
So in 132 AD was another revolt against the Roman Empire, and this was led by a military leader by the name of Simon Bar Kokhba was what he was called. Kokhba means star, and a very prominent rabbi of that day declared him the Messiah, and he was going to defeat the Romans. Well, it didn't work out that way. Everybody ended up dead, and Jerusalem was trashed once again. The third revolt, which happened sometime later, I don't remember the exact date, led to the Romans finally saying, look, we're sick of this. They made it illegal for Jews to live in Judea. They plowed Jerusalem under, and they put up a temple to the god Jupiter on the Temple Mount. And they just said, we're done. And I believe, if I remember correctly, they actually salted the land around Jerusalem. They were pissed. And but a lot of scholars 50, 60 years ago would have told you that when Christianity and the Jews parted company was with the Bar Kokhba revolt. And part of the rationale behind that is if you remember, Jesus says, when you see armies arrayed against Jerusalem, flee. And so the party line was that the Christian Jews, the Jews who were followers of Jesus, saw Rome coming and attacking Jerusalem, and they fled, and they abandoned their fellow Jews, and they resented it so much that this was really kind of the break between Jews and Christians. Scholars now have come to accept, most scholars, that this is indeed not the case. Certainly that may have been a blow to the relationship with Jewish followers of Jesus, but not the final blow. Really, the final blow was Constantine declaring the Roman Empire a Christian nation. And so we have a long period of time, several centuries. That happened in 313, if I remember correctly. So really, it's like 300 years after. And one could argue it even went a little further than that. We'll talk about that in a minute. And some of you guys have been coming to these talks. I'm covering material we've covered before, but since we got a new crowd, I'm kind of backing up and explaining things. So a term that you guys have been here before have heard me talk about is the concept of complex common Judaism. You remember this term at all, or no, you forgot it like the joke? Okay.
It's hard getting old.
Yeah. So again, another common misconception is that the rabbis were in charge during Jesus' day. This is not the case at all. In Jesus' day, you had what scholars call complex common Judaism. You had all these different types of Jewish level of observance that was all over the map. The Pharisees, who ultimately became the rabbis, were just one group out of all these different groups. You had itinerant teachers, like John the Baptist was one of them. You had Jesus was an itinerant teacher, but there were many others. You guys probably heard of the Essenes with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Sadducees, of course, are very prominent in the New Testament. But even beyond that, just if you went from one village to another, you might find various levels of different observances and traditions that were going on. So that's the complex part of it, right? Is that it wasn't like a unified, all Jews in Israel do these things. Now the common part is, yes, there were common things. Like it's pretty unlikely any Jews were eating pigs, right? That would be a common thing. It's pretty certain that most Jews were circumcising their sons on the 8th day. So there were common practices, but then there was quite a bit of variety within those practices. So the Pharisees, who eventually became the rabbis, were just one voice in that whole thing. The rabbis were not in control. One scholar wrote, "Ancient Judaism is best seen as a type of complex adaptive system that maintained enough order and structure to amount to common Judaism, but which was sufficiently chaotic to allow for innovation." And so this, by the way, is what allowed Jewish followers of Jesus to be followers of Jesus but still considered Jews. It was just another flavor of Judaism. And they were not viewed as being non-Jews if they follow Jesus like you would here today. Quite often Jews will say to Messianic Jews, "You're not really Jews because you believe in Jesus." But this is a much later invention. The reality is, in this book Borderlines that I suggested people read if they wanted to get more information, he talks about how the boundary between who's a Jew and who's a Christian was very porous, and that you had a lot of movement back and forth across this border. And so what you really have is not this natural parting of ways between Judaism and Christianity, more as it was Christianity saying, this is what it means to be a Christian, and you had the rabbi saying, this is what it means to be a Jew. And they basically agreed on a border, like two countries, right? And they said, this is our agreed upon border, hello, welcome, between us, and we're cool. As long as you guys stay on that side, and we stay on this side, and we've got a wall up and barbed wire and all that, we're okay. And this pretty much exists to this day. But the fact is that before that border was established, this border was very porous, and practices were making its way both ways across these things. And as a matter of fact, I think I mentioned this in a previous talk, that I used to be very skeptical about the notion that during the Passover Seder, and you guys, I did a Seder there at the church a few years ago, and I talked about this then, is in the Seder, there's a part of the ceremony where you have a bag with 3 wafers of matzah in it. You guys that were there, do you remember that? And you pull out the middle one and break it. And some people think that this was a Christian practice, essentially a Messianic Jewish practice, that made its way into Judaism, but then lost the significance of it being the Trinity. And I used to be very skeptical about that until I studied more and realized that no, this border was that porous, that this indeed could have happened in that way. And that this now very accepted and revered Jewish practice for the Passover Seder could have originally come from a Christian influence. You can always tell that there's issues that people are dealing with if you look at the edicts that are being presented. For example, in the Torah it says don't steal, don't lie, don't commit adultery. Why are they saying these things? Because people were doing them, right? And God's saying, no, don't do these things. Well, you see this with church councils, these edicts. There's an edict issued from the Synod of Elvira in 306 AD that prohibited intermarriage and eating together of Christians and Jews. That means it was happening, and they were concerned about this. That was violating this border between them. They weren't very comfortable with that. The Edict of Milan in 315 said that Jews are no longer allowed to proselytize. Well, who were they probably proselytizing? They were probably Christians converting to Judaism as they interacted with each other. And the church was concerned about this. The Council of Nicaea, where we get the Nicene Creed in 325, Christians are not allowed to observe Passover anymore, was part of that edict. The Council of Laodicea in 424, Christians cannot worship on the Sabbath, and Christians cannot get unleavened bread from Jews, nor eat unleavened bread with them. Again, this is most likely dealing with the issue of Passover, and it's, conflict with Easter. Other laws. In 337, the Emperor of Rome issued an edict that marriage between Jews and Christians was punishable by death. In 339, converting to Judaism became a crime to actually convert. So what do all these things tell us? They tell us that these things were happening. This border was porous, and Christianity was wanting to have a very nice, hard border, and so was Judaism. They were in cahoots on this to say, we got to have this strong border between the two of us. So how did they do this? Well, if you look at the edicts, you can kind of gather that on the Christian side, what the church did is they gave up to the Jews anything that are these behavior markers of Jewish identity. So Sabbath observance, no, it's on Sunday. Circumcision is not to be performed. Festivals, the Jewish holidays, that's not appropriate for Christians anymore. It needs to be practiced. That's for the Jews. The kosher laws, etc., so forth and so on. So it was these very signature behaviors of that are observances of laws from the Old Testament that the church pushed out of. They said, if you practice these things, you're a heretic. You're not kosher anymore. You need to decide which side of the border you want to be on. The rabbis, in like manner, gave up a major theological point. And it's what's referred to, what Boyarin refers to in his book as logos theology. And this is the belief that there was more than one person in the Godhead. It may surprise you that this was a very common Jewish belief back in those days. It's been completely driven out to the point that we don't think about it that way, right? Jews believe in one God, not a Trinity. That's a Christian thing. That's because Judaism gave that up to the church and said, we're going to push out anybody that believes this, even though it used to be an acceptable belief within Judaism, we're going to give that over to the church. That's not us. If you believe in that, then you're no longer a Jew, and you need to go away. Does that make sense? Where does this come from in Judaism? Well, we don't know if Jews were Trinitarian, but they were at least Binitarian, two persons in the Godhood. And where this comes from is, there's a number of places. I did a whole talk on this last year. But the two of the main sources is there's a passage in Daniel where God appears to be an old man and also a young man, a warrior and a scholar, as the rabbis read it. And this led to a whole tradition within Judaism that there was this Ancient of Days, the Father, and there was this Son of Man who was this person who was God, but yet distinct from God. And in the Daniel passage, I believe it's chapter 7 of Daniel, it talks about him being enthroned next to God. Sound really familiar? And many scholars believe that many Jews in the first century were Binitarian, if not most Jews were Binitarian. But because this was so close to Trinitarianism of the church, the rabbis eventually pushed this theology out of Judaism and said, no, we can't have this, it's too much. And it helped them erect this border. Does that make sense? Any questions there? You think you're full of questions? I haven't answered any yet.
At which point would you say that they pushed out the idea of Jesus?
Pardon me?
They pushed out Jesus as a Messiah.
Well, it would be part and parcel of this, right? The idea that, this is another common thing held today is Jews can't believe that a man would be God. But there's nothing in early Judaism that precluded that. This is part of this defining the border between the two sides that they said, nope, this is something that Christians have, let's give it to them and be done with it. So that happened sometime in that first 300 years of the new millennium. In the book, Boyarin has a whole chapter, we're not going to go into it in depth, but he goes into a whole chapter about the first chapter of John, where John begins with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, so forth and so on. That word there is logos. We talked about this in a previous talk. In Hebrew, it's davar, which means word. And more importantly, in Aramaic, it's memra. And what we have is all kinds of text from the late, from the Second Temple period, where written in Aramaic that talk about the memra as being another person in the Godhood. And what they're keying in on is, if you go back to the Old Testament, you see all kinds of places where it says, the word of the Lord came to so-and-so. The word of the Lord spoke to so-and-so. That word began to be viewed as a person. This wasn't just a poetic way of saying it, but this word, this davar, this logos, this memra was this younger man, the Son of Man, who was with the Father, the Ancient of Days. And so, Boyarin unpacks that in one of the chapters, talking about how, again, earlier on, scholars thought that John chapter 1 was very much influenced by Greek philosophy. And he says, no, this is actually a Jewish concept, that this word was another person within the Godhead, and that word became flesh, was within the complex common Judaism of the day, was perfectly acceptable concept to have. Does that make sense? And so, if you read the book, he does a really good job of that.
So what relationship does that memra have to the personification of wisdom?
Right. That's it.
The same thing?
Yeah, the word is all, sometimes the word is referred to as Sophia in Greek, which means wisdom. Sometimes that was made as like the feminine aspect of God, with some of the writings. Now, interestingly enough, there is a third aspect of God within Jewish tradition that goes way back, but it never took on quite the full form of accepting this as a third person in the Godhead, and that is a feminine aspect of God called the Shekinah. The Shekinah was the presence of God. It was the Shekinah that resided over the ark in the Holy of Holies in the temple. You know, it was the Shekinah that fled when Israel went into exile several times. The rabbis saw this as the Shekinah went into exile with them. The Shekinah was like this aspect of God, not quite sure how to define it. You know, they didn't quite define it, but it was this aspect of God that was closely attached to the people of Israel, to the point that it even went with them into exile. And so we do have this aspect that would be, you know, similar to the concept of the Holy Spirit, but yet it never got fully turned into a third person in that way.
Isn't that word conceptualized the glory of God in some?
Yeah, sometimes it's referred to as glory. Yeah.
Is that a Jewish? Would Jews translate it that too, or is that just
Yeah,
charismatics who do that?
I'm not sure. Maybe. I'd have to go back and look.
But it's a sense of it's God's presence anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't that cool?
Would that be the same presence that followed in the desert, in the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire?
Yes, that was viewed as the Shekinah. Yeah. Interestingly enough, you know, there's, you know, I did a whole thing on Midrash, right? Remember that? In the Midrashic text, it even talks about the Shekinah was what was in the thorn bush, speaking to Moses, right? And it's in a thorn bush, suffering like the people are suffering in slavery. And you could do all kinds of stuff with that, with, you know, with Yeshua and the thorns on his head, you know, there's something there. You could do something with that. This concept of the word can be found in a Jewish author by the name of Philo, who lived in Alexandria, Egypt. And he wrote in one of his writings, to his word, referring to God, capital W word, his chief messenger, highest in age and honor, the Father has given the special prerogative to stand on the border and separate the creature from the created. So he's expressing this idea that this memra, this word, this logos, is given this special place between God and creation. He is neither created by God nor created as you, but midway between the two extremes. So Philo is sort of expressing this logos theology that existed in Judaism in that day. This was not a heretical thing at all. It's only much later, as the rabbis drove this out, that it became to be viewed as a heresy. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. I got a slide here. I'm trying to decide what I want to say about it. Another recent development in scholarship in the last 50 years is this realization that people used to think, now the Talmud is a body of Jewish law, and it's made up of two main sections. There's the Mishnah, which is the earlier section, and there's the Gemara that happened much later. The Mishnah was written down in the very early part of the first century. The Gemara was written around the year 500 to 600, so, you know, quite a few years later. And the Mishnah portion of this is a very compact, they're like cliff notes, right? It's the oral law, it's the legal traditions developed from the written law by the Pharisees, who became the rabbis, wrote this down after the destruction of the temple. And most scholars think that sometimes people say, well, it was oral until they wrote it down. But really, there were probably many different versions of this. It was probably teachers' notes, as they trained new rabbis. But then they took all these and they said, okay, this is the body of Jewish law. It's the Mishnah, right? What the recent development is that most scholars accept the fact now that in the year 500 to 600, it was that level of rabbis, that generation of rabbis, who not only wrote the Gemara, which is commentary on the Mishnah, so it tries to expand out those cliff notes and make sense of it, but they also heavily redacted the Talmud in reaction to Christianity gaining so much power within the Roman Empire. And so again, we don't have just this. Scholars used to think that there was the Talmud represented this gradual passing on of tradition from one generation to the next. And now they've come to realize, no, there was some heavy editing done during this time, and partly in response to the growth of Gentile Christianity in the Roman Church. Does that make sense?
Can you give an example of something that would have been edited?
Well, I think he gives an example in the book of where there's a section of the Talmud where a rabbi is excommunicated because he believes there's more than one power in heaven. This would be an example of something that was probably edited to sound more drastic than it originally was. Does that make sense? And that he ends up being completely ostracized because of this. So you see that logos theology being driven out of Judaism. Both the early church fathers and the early rabbis did another thing to try to solidify their authority, and that is they tried to define this clear lineage of succession. So in the church, you have the concept of apostolic succession, that the early apostles handed it down to the early church fathers, to the various bishops, throughout the centuries, that this authority is this contiguous line from the apostles all the way up to them. If you can establish that, then you can say, I'm the one that has the correct beliefs and practices, and if you don't follow this, you're not part of that heritage of truth, right? The rabbis did a similar thing. The rabbis, what they did is they traced their laws all the way back to Sinai. That's pretty good, isn't it? And here's what's written in the Talmud. There's a section of the Talmud. The Talmud's not all law. There's stories in there and funny things and all kinds of stuff. There's also a whole section called Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers. It's kind of more reads like the book of Proverbs. And in Pirkei Avot, it actually starts off with, Moses received the Torah at Sinai and he handed it down to Joshua. Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. This would be the Sanhedrin. Who's missing in that lineage? Who's not there? It goes from Moses to Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the Sanhedrin. The priest. Yeah, the priests aren't in there. The Sadducees aren't there. Right? That's who the Sadducees were. They were connected to the temple. So here you've got the Pharisees rewriting history and working the Sadducees out of the picture. And they're saying our traditions that we developed, that was just one of many different traditions in Jesus' day, but ours is the one that actually came all the way back, goes all the way back to Sinai. And to this day, Orthodox Jews will tell you that both the written law and the oral law were given at Sinai in some mysterious way. And but then you say, but wait a minute. We have in the rabbi's document itself, differing opinions on different laws. Right? You see them arguing. The way the Talmud's written is like case law. Right? If anybody here a lawyer? Anything? Good, that won't look stupid. Okay. If you look at case law, it doesn't just say this is the law. If you kill someone, you get 10 to 20 years. Case law actually brings in different cases and they wrestle with them together. And this is what lawyers do when they're defending or prosecuting, is they bring in these pre-existing cases and they try to weave their argument and so forth. That's the way the Talmud is written. So you've got these differing opinions between these rabbis. But wait a minute, if God gave it at Sinai, how can you have differing opinions? Right? How does that work? Well, the rabbis came with an answer for that. And there's a story in the Talmud where this rabbi actually says this. He goes, dudes, how can he be right and he be right? They can't both be right. And then this rabbi says, these are the words of the living God, and these also are the words of the living God. They're both the words of God, but they disagree. And the concept is the mere arguing about it is actually part of God's plan. It's actually rather ingenious to do it this way. That the actual arguing about it is part of God's plan, and these both become the words of the living God, even though they're conflicting with one another. Pretty clever, huh? And in a way, there's a beauty to that I appreciate. Because I think there is an aspect of us discovering the mind of God through argument and disagreement and discussion. But this was the rabbi's way of, again, trying to cement their authority and their succession going all the way back to Moses. This is, by the way, why the rabbis actually deny that they're Pharisees. They actually don't claim to be Pharisees. As a matter of fact, there's texts where they refer to the Pharisees as heretics. But they came from the Pharisees. But the thing is they don't want to be just one sect of Judaism. They want to be the sect. And so they kind of distance themselves from that, and they say, we're the rabbis, not the Pharisees. We're not Sadducees. We're the guys that got it from the beginning all the way down. So they kind of rewrite this succession just like the church did to kind of say we're the ones that have the authority. By the way, another common misconception is that the rabbis were an authority. They really weren't. It isn't until the Middle Ages that the rabbis really became the central authority figures over the Jewish population. At this time especially, these first 5 to 6 centuries, the rabbis are kind of these dudes in an ivory tower arguing amongst themselves, and nobody's coming to them saying, hey, is this chicken kosher? Unless they happen to be a student, of them. They willingly say, I want to, be a part of this group, this school, and be subject to it. Yes?
So who are the power brokers that drew the line if the rabbis were not the authority?
Well, it was the rabbis doing it, and then sort of the population came later. It's sort of like they drew the line and tried to force this barrier that only fully got enforced once they became the actual authority figures over things. Another thing that both the church and the rabbis did is they attempted to define heresies. How am I doing on time anyway? And so for the church in this early century was dealing with all kinds of conflicting theology of their day. That's why they had all these church councils. They were wrestling with these issues. One of them was a guy by the name of Arius who claimed that, I remember which one he is. That Jesus did not actually appear physically, because he kind of adopted this Greek view that, maybe a Gnostic view might be a better way of saying it, that matter is evil and spirit is good, so how could the Messiah, the Son of God, actually have a physical body? And so there was a large segment of the church that went along with this and said, no, Jesus just appeared to be physical in the body. The early church fathers fought against that and argued against that. You have these church councils dealing with that. Another guy, was by the name of Marcion, who said, I can't deal with the judgmental God of the Old Testament and the loving God of the New Testament. These were two different gods. And again, he had a great following in the early church. But the church fathers had to say, no, this is what we believe, and you're now a heretic. They had to make those definitions as they wrestled with things to figure that out. And quite often what they did is they equated heretic with Jew. And we see this in the writings of, and this is again from the book, Justin Martyr, who was a early church father. He lived in the 100s, and his last name's Martyr, not because his parents were named Martyr, but he was martyred. That's where we get the term from. But he wrote this book called A Dialogue with Trypho. Trypho was supposedly a Jew that he was having this dialogue with. That was most likely just fabricated. But what he did is he tried to push all these Christian heresies into Judaism and say, this is Jewish thought, this is not Christian thought, this is Christian heresy, by doing that. And so you see him wrestling with these concepts and then moving it and pushing it off towards the Jews. In his book, he says, Jews say that this power can never be cut off from, he's talking about the Trinity here. And this is an example of the Arian heresy that Jesus didn't have a physical body, right? So that's what he's talking about here. But he gives it to the Jews. He says, Jews say that the power can never be cut off from the Father. In the same way, the light of the sun cannot be cut off. So the Father makes, when he will, his power to spring forward, and when he will, to draw it back into himself. So this is, he's taken this idea that was very prominent in the early church, that Jesus and the Holy Spirit really aren't like separate entities within the Godhead. It's just like a periodic manifestation of God that he then brings back. Kind of like sunlight coming out of the sun, but it's really not distinct from the sun, is what he's drawing here. Does that make sense? And so, yes, the Jews were probably saying God is God. There's not multiple ones because they're trying to drive that out. And then but what he's doing is he's taking this heresy within Christianity and trying to drive it back and say this is a Jewish thing. It's not part of the church. So in dealing with heresies within Christianity, he's trying to basically equate Jews with heretics. But the rabbis aren't much better. They do the same kind of thing. They define what is heresy and they push it out the other way. There is a prayer in the liturgy that still exists to this day. You guys may feel uncomfortable, but I pray it every day. Called the Birkat Haminim. It's the blessing of the heretics. Blessing of the heretics. But it was a way for the rabbis to work into the liturgy a prayer that if you disagreed with them, you weren't going to feel very comfortable reciting this in the prayer. And this arose about the time of the 3rd century. So here's one version of it. There's been many different versions. The version today is very different than this one. But it says, for the apostates, let there be no hope, and let the arrogant government be speedily uprooted in our days. Let the Notzarim, which is Christian, and the Minim, heretics, be destroyed in a moment, and let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be inscribed together with the righteous. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who humbles the arrogant. So this was the prayer in the 3rd century as we have in one text. But notice here that they've split off Christian and heretic. So Christians would be Christians, and this heretic are who? We don't actually totally know. It's people that the rabbis wanted to push out of Judaism. It could be that it was some element of Sadducees yet. It's also possible these could be Roman informants. They were Jews who were spying on fellow Jews for the Roman Empire. We don't totally know, but there were these people labeled heretics that they were trying to push out of the synagogue and push out of Judaism. This prayer today has taken a softer form, and it speaks about slanderers. So even though I pray that, I'm not asking God to blot you guys out of the book of life. So that's a good thing. But I view it as a prayer against those who would slander God. And I think that's the way most modern Jews would view this prayer as well. Let's see, was there any more on that? I think there was. Yes. Oh, and the other thing is, earlier forms of this prayer did not have the word Notzarim in it. The earlier forms said nothing about Christians. Again, you're seeing this being added as Christianity gets bigger and bigger and more dominant, that Christianity becomes an issue and somebody to struggle with. So it's only here in the 3rd century that we see Notzarim being included. Any questions there? So,
I have a question, actually.
yes.
So when you get that, when the Notzarim were included in there, referring to the Christians, do you think that it primarily was referring at that point to the Gentile church that was becoming powerful, or was that at that point, and is singling out one set of the Manim who were Messianic or Jewish followers of Jesus?
No, that's a good question.
Distinguishing them from the rabbinic.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this is really Jews in the synagogue who were holding to Jesus as the Messiah that they were wanting to drive out. I don't think it was so much the Roman Empire. It was more, we got to get rid of these guys in our midst who are
to be both Jewish and
right.
and Jesus followers.
Yeah. And so what we see, Chris actually wrote a paper on this, which she shared with me. It was a very good paper. Is Chris talked about, I don't know if it was somebody else's phrase or not, but we'll give it to you. The rickety bridge. That was yours?
Actually, no, that was.
No. Say it was yours. It was great. The rickety bridge of Messianic Judaism, right? You had these Jews who bridged the Gentile church and Judaism, the synagogue. But as this border got established, this bridge got demolished. You had to go one way or the other. You either had to give up all the Jewish practices that the church was expelling and essentially become a Gentile to be a Christian, or you had to give up belief that Jesus is the Son of God and go back to Judaism. So these two groups basically forced the guys in the middle to go away. And that's what we had for almost 1,500 years, was no Jews in the middle. And then really it was in the 1800s that you begin the process of Jews realizing, hey, I can follow the God of Israel and his Messiah and still be a Jew because they're Jews. And why can't I do that? So they started to build that back together. And
I have a question.
yes, ma'am.
Did anybody resist all this?
We don't have. You mean like in an argumentative way, or whatever?
Or an enclave of stubborn
Jews, stubborn Messianic Jews.
Yeah. Believers or people who were out of touch. They were still in the wilderness and happily doing it. Nobody knew they were there. Or I don't know. Or even any Gentiles resisted because it wasn't fully scriptural, or because.
The fact that you have all these church edicts against these practices tells you that there were probably Gentile Christians still going to synagogues, and there were probably Jews who, Messianic Jews, what we would call them today, who were in synagogue, but then also hanging out with the Goyim and recognizing them as brothers and sisters in Messiah. But do we have any documents? They're really, not that I'm aware of, anything where there was somebody writing saying, no, this is wrong. Except where you see it at is in the New Testament,
So
right? You see in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, this big struggle about what do we do with these Gentiles who are coming to faith. And you've got some Jews, again, they don't necessarily listen to James in the council in Jerusalem. Some Jews say, no, these guys got to become Jews. They want to be saved, they got to be Jews. And then you have Paul, vociferously saying, no, that's not right. God is doing something new here, and arguing against that. But that's about the only record that I'm aware of that we have of anybody resisting it.
So we surmise that they existed, whether they resisted or not, because of the edicts themselves.
Yes.
Isaac, I've read a few different places that have speculated that the Jewish followers of Jesus continued, were not totally wiped out even by the 3rd or 4th century, that there were some, enclaves or some populations that were around still even into the 8th or 9th century. Not very many, but they were around. They were not maybe as completely annihilated as early as is often thought. I don't know what your thoughts on that.
No, I've read those accounts as well, and makes sense to me. It's kind of interesting that the last remnants of that, hints of that, is about the time rabbis actually had full authority and said, this is Orthodox Judaism.
Yeah, probably not an accident.
Yeah, it may not be an accident. That was sort of the final death knell of the whole thing.
Another thought that occurs to me, and I had to think about your question, is it's kind of like in other things besides religion as well. It's sort of to the victors go the spoil, and also to the victors go the writing of history. And it kind of, ties into what you were talking about earlier in terms of how the church setting up this whole history of apostolic succession, because they needed to establish authority, and the rabbis doing the same thing, developing this history of rabbinic authority running all the way back to Sinai. In the process of doing that,
They're writing everybody else out.
yeah, they're writing everybody else out of the story. So
Yeah, exactly. So the parting of the ways, as is often referred to, is really a partitioning of the ways. It's not this gradual departure, but it's two groups wrestling with their own identity and defining the opposite of them in order to come to a conclusion of what their identity is and to build that border. And this is why Messianic Jews freak out people today on both sides. I've had Christians who are horrified that I exist, and I've had Jews that are horrified that I exist, because we blur that boundary again. We're crossing over. The rickety bridge is being rebuilt very slowly. And boy, is it rickety, let me tell you. But it not even be a bridge yet. It's a couple of toothpicks and popsicle sticks.
Judaism and his wife, he told me they had vicious arguments because, the guy and his wife, because his wife said it's like being Jewish is like the opposite of being a Christian. And he, though he wasn't a Christian, would say, woman, you don't know what you're talking about. And he would basically tell her that all it is that they don't accept the Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah, and the Christians do. It's like the fact of whether or not you accept Jesus or not. But it's not this diametrically opposed opposite thing that so they get
right.
It was interesting that they had that argument.
Yeah. Well, this is what happens though, is when one group gets a lot of power and prestige, then other groups have to define themselves against that. So Jews, unfortunately, got kind of pushed in the corner of being not Christian, especially in Western Europe, right? And, it's because they were just up against this juggernaut that what could they do?
So I see the institutionalization of the church, or the establishment, that's the word I'm looking for, the establishment of the church as a national entity in the 4th century as being a big problem on all kinds of fronts, having caused, is that basically what happened? Is that why there was this, nails got driven into the coffin of Jewish Christian unity, or at least relations? And because I see it as driving the nail in the coffin of, or at least starting to, of Christian nonviolence, which was pretty universal before that. And then after that, you had to, in order to be in the army, you had to be baptized. There's just all kinds of things that got muddied. And then, of course, the church leadership is now connected to the emperor, and that gets political interests muddy things. And so I see that basically church establishment being like a bad guy, like a big ploy of the devil to attempt to destroy the church.
Well,
Which has been
that,
done damage, but of course God
Yeah.
let it do
Right.
the whole thing.
And I would say on the Jewish side as well,
Yeah.
right? There was this very, this rupture that occurred between Israel and the church that God never intended. And was it human sinfulness? Was it evil forces at play? Was it both that caused this rupture to occur? People to not, hold to what the original plan was. Very much so. Which is how I'm ending this. And oh man, I don't have the slide to show my slide. I had one picture for you guys.
You can act that there.
I can act it out.
You have an iPad there?
Huh?
Is that an iPad you have there?
No.
Oh, you had one the other day.
Yeah, I could draw it real quick. Because it's really, really small in my handout. So I came up with this diagram. Some of you have seen it before as how I view things. It's a Venn diagram. So if this sheet of paper is humanity, this is all of humanity. Even people that we don't think belong. If you draw Israel, so all Jews are inside of this circle, all non-Jews are outside of that circle. And then if you draw the church this way, my doctor's office is calling me. If you draw the church this way, intersecting, then everything where it intersects here is the body of, should be all of this. Should look at my paper. See how I did it? Yeah. All of this is the body of Messiah. Out here are Gentile Christians. Out here are Gentile Christians. And in the middle are Messianic Jews.
Can you hold it up?
Can you see a little bit better? So,
Bring it a little closer.
So did you go through where you're at on there again?
so what you have here is, this is all Jews, right? And this circle oval is the corporate body, the body of Christ, the body of Messiah. But there's two parts to it. You have, it just happens that it's split just because of the way you draw a diagram. But you have Gentile Christians and Jewish followers of Jesus make up that part. They're distinct, but yet together in that way. Then I added This is the part I really like. This actually doesn't have much to do with everything, but I just think it's cool. In the very center is God, right? God is at the very center of the church, but he's also at the center of humanity. They just don't know it, right? And he's also at the center of Israel. They just don't know it. But he's the center of everything, right? Then I added another piece. That's really cool. Because I said it was. There's a circle around God called Jesus or Yeshua, right? And I drew it that way very deliberately because sometimes, see, she's mad at me, she's leaving. She hates my diagram. She told me she had to leave early. She goes, don't be offended if I leave. So I had to give her a hard time. Anyway, sometimes Jesus can eclipse the Father. We make so much about Jesus that we forget about the Father, right? So by drawing him this way, it's expressing this idea that Jesus brings us to the Father. That's his role. Let's not forget the Father. He doesn't eclipse the Father. He brings us to the Father. And he is also at the center of all of creation, just as the Father is, because he ultimately will bring a redeemed creation back to the Father. That's his role. So I may refine this down the road, I don't know, but this is my drawing. It's not.
Is there anything else to it?
Huh?
That's Binitarian. Where's the Trinitarian?
Yeah, I have to fill it up. I'm a Jew, I'm Binitarian, sorry. So, how do we mend this rift that's existed? So what that diagram is expressing is this idea of what our rabbi wrote a book. Some of you may have read it some years ago, called Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism. And he coins the term bilateral ecclesiology. There we go. So bilateral, there's two corporate bodies within the body of Messiah, Gentile church and Israel. But it's this ecclesiology. It's the body of Messiah, but it's these two groups that are joined together. Just as Paul says in Romans 11 that the church has been grafted into Israel. There's this, Jews don't stop being Jews. Gentiles don't have to become Jews, but Jews also don't have to quit being Jews. We're together, co-equals within the body. We had a lady visit our synagogue a couple of weeks ago, a Christian woman, and I talked to her afterwards, and probably shouldn't say this because she might listen to it, I don't know. But anyway, I asked her, well, what brought you here? And she said, well, you guys are closer to God. And I said, no, I mean, it's not the reality. Matter of fact, we're a bunch of lunkheads. And, it's equal. They're equal partners within the body of Messiah. So, actually, Chris got me thinking about this a couple of years ago because she asked me one time, what would this bilateral ecclesiology look like on the ground? What would be a practical expression of that? I'm like, I never thought about that before. So here's what I came up with. First of all, I think that congregations who realize this can make sure that they renounce any supersessionist claims of the church wiping out the people of Israel. This is often referred to as replacement theology. Maybe even to put it into a church mission statement or a statement of faith or something like that the church doesn't replace the people of Israel as the people of God. To preach and teach within this context, and this is something that we practice here at the synagogue, is frequently in our sermons, we're talking about this relationship between Israel and the church. It's not just us guys over here, but we talk about our Christian brothers and sisters and how they're an important part of the body of Messiah, and it would be great to see churches doing this as well. And if you understand it this way as two corporate entities, and you understand that that the laws that God put into place for Jews are still there, they haven't been wiped out, as often is taught, then if you have Jewish friends who are not believers in Jesus, you can at least encourage them to be good Jews. That they can at least try to go back to the teachings of Judaism. Make connections. Most churches connect the Passover because of Easter. But what about the fall holidays? Those get ignored, completely. And it'd be really cool to see some corporate Christian expression of these fall holidays. Study Messianic Jewish friendly materials, I called it. There are both Jewish and Christian scholars who like Boyarin. Boyarin, by the way, is an Orthodox Jew. In the prologue, he talks about this. He doesn't believe Jesus is the Messiah, but he loves Christians. And but yet he's an Orthodox Jew. But he just thinks Christians are the cat's meow. And he talks a bit about why that is. So there are scholars out there who, both Jewish and Christian, who understand these kinds of concepts. And, churches would be well to take some of these up and look at them. Connect to a local Messianic Jewish congregation. That could be something as well. So that was just kind of some thoughts that I had about it that I had shared with Chris when, she and I were talking about it. But, we really need to find a way to bring these two sides of the body of Messiah back together and not have this rift. And one of the ways that we've tried to do that is by having this occasional communion service, and we invite a church group in. And I had contacted Joyce to see if Celine Presbyterian would like to bring some folks over sometime and do that. We did this church here one time. We did the Vineyard Church came and did it a couple of years ago. But we realized we're taking communion all the time, and our Christian brothers and sisters aren't here with us. We need to have that. This is missing. It's not reflecting the wholeness of things. And so we started taking on that practice. So I do not believe that God intended for there to be a Christian religion and a Jewish religion. I think he intended that there to be one body of both Jews and Gentiles who worship the God of Israel and his Messiah. And it's human sinfulness and the evil one who got in the way of all that and caused this huge rift and caused them to put up the Arizona wall between Mexico and the United States, and to block that. Metaphorically. So, any questions?
That one's not a bad one, too.
Well, again, there's varying opinions about this. But, yes, sir.
This is the question. Would you at some point, as we close here, say a prayer for unity in Hebrew?
In Hebrew? No. I can do it in English for you.
Either way. I just know God listens to Hebrew better than English.
Oh, yeah. That's... Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
I've only read part of the first chapter and the introduction to this Boyarin's book.
Mm-hmm.
But it kind of gives orthodoxy a bad name.
Which one?
He says that orthodoxy isn't a thing, it's an attitude. And then he carefully defines it so that I can hopefully use his definition while I'm reading his book. But my understanding of orthodoxy is, well, the literal meaning of the word is right belief. So those councils and all things, historically, they're extremely important to me. They're where, because, people were struggling with, reasoning out, okay, then if God is 3, then what does that mean? And they struggle with it, and they struggle with it, and it causes problems, and then the Holy Spirit gets together with the guys, and then they codify it, or at least they define it, or they help. And interpretation, right interpretation and things like that. That's all seems all very important to me.
And I agree.
And cool. So, but just in that first part of the book, Boyarin seems to say, and this is the whole problem.
Well, you have to remember he's writing from a certain point of view, right? Yeah. And he's actually an Orthodox Jew, not totally comfortable with his own faith, which he expresses in there. Too. Yeah, he is something of a pariah.
Border dweller.
Yes, he is.
He's talking border lines, but he's
he definitely is. He does not. He talks in there about being accosted by fellow congregants because of his views on modern Israel, his views on homosexuality, things like this. That he takes a more liberal approach to some of these things, and so he's also expressing some discomfort with his own tradition. But I would agree with you. I hope I didn't convey the notion that all these councils were bad, because I think they were good. They had to deal with these conflicting beliefs and thoughts and come to some kind of a conclusion of what does the Bible really say? What was Jesus really teaching? What did the apostles teach? It's just the bad side of it is that it kind of then became a way of saying that we have to push Judaism out of the church, right? So in the midst of wrestling with these heresies, they also say we can't have that rickety bridge. We have to have the solid border between the two. So it's not like they're all bad. But in the midst of that goodness, there was also this bad side effect that we got this rift. And the same for the rabbis on their side. These guys are in cahoots with one another. So, does that help at all or no?
Yeah, I still have, I don't know if I'll ever be satisfied with an answer to the question about why.
Why?
Why?
What?
All this happened. Why did they do this? Why? I mean, I'm seeing political reasons. I'm seeing, things like.
God doesn't seem to just, he does this with Israel, right? He redeems Israel out of Egypt. He gives them the Torah, but he doesn't completely abolish slavery. He doesn't make women total equals to men. He doesn't seem to do that. And the same way that he kind of just let church history do what it did, and you get this sort of, mixed bag. You get good and bad in the midst of it. And somehow I guess that's part of he's just like, that's cool. It'll all sort out at the end.
It'll all sort out.
That's argue that, we're supposed to help with the creation. That goes into a whole new thing, right?
Yeah,
Some
no,
of the
it's...
things in doing that we're getting wrong.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Because he gives us that free will.
We have that freedom to screw it up, and we're really good at it.
Yeah.
It's a gift.
Yeah, I think absolutely true, and I think that goes through the entire study of all of this, of religion in general, is through the ages, we people that were made by one creator have tried to figure out why we need to be different and better than one another. That shouldn't be there, but we continue to do it today. And if you read the gospel, certainly Paul he's a Jew. I mean, he's a Jew. He doesn't never deny he's a Jew, but Christians tend to want to read it with a different set of lenses than how it's actually written. So there's a lot of misunderstanding. When I hear you say things like, trace back to Sinai, well, how do you get rid of creation then? Because creation was. And if you're only going back to Sinai, then what are you going to do about Abraham and, you know, the covenants that were made?
Sure.
As human beings, we've hacked it up royally.
Yeah. Well, the reason they only go back to Sinai is they're very focused on the Torah. They're very focused on God's law. You know, that was seen as a seminal moment in Jewish history. So they're not denying before that, but they're just saying, you know, this is when God gave us the law, and then we're now the inheritors of that, you know, to say what God really meant. Right? Yes, sir.
A question question my dad actually brought up to me because he has a Jewish friend, and he's been thinking about bringing her to his church, which is Lutheran, but he's also afraid to because he thinks she's going to be offended because he's noticing that when he reads the New Testament, you know, it refers to the Jews. The Jews do this, the Jews do that, the Jews do this, and in most of the descriptions, it's a negative thing. Like the Jews were evil, you know? It just seems like, and that was wondering, like, is the Jews the right translation, or should it be like the Pharisees or the Jews? I mean, is that really the right translation? Because they're all Jewish. I mean,
Yeah.
the Bible's Jewish, and so.
Right. Well, yes, I did a talk on this, or it was part of a talk last year, that really most times that is really referring to Judeans. There was this split between North and South. Galilee were the country bumpkins, and the power brokers were all in Judea and Jerusalem. And it's these religious Judean authorities who ended up crucifying Jesus, right? And so and most of his disciples were Galileans. And so you have this text that where it's talking about Jews, it's most of the time referring to Judeans. And sometimes it's used in a more generic fashion, but yeah, so it's expressing this rift that was between the North and the South. So he should bring her here.
That's what I was going to say, because we've really focused the service to reach out to Jewish people so that they feel comfortable.
I've been talking to him, and
You know,
he
because
has
they go to
been,
church, they don't focus is so different.
he has been fascinated with Judaism, where she invited him to a bar mitzvah. And he was sitting there, my dad is the son of a pastor, and he was looking at the Torah that they had, or I think it was a Torah, they had the book here, like, he was just reading it. And he said, he went on a part talking about that Abraham and Isaac, or Abraham was supposed to kill Isaac. And then he noticed a commentary in the bottom, which he thought was amazing. He said, it said, Christians believe this, you know, has connection with Jesus. But he was amazed that he said, just as a matter of fact, it didn't say Christians wrongly believe or something like that. It was just a comment. But he
Well,
said,
part of that is if I say wrongly, they could beat me up.
but it was just interesting. He was just fascinated with all the connections he was making between his own faith.
Yeah, no, that's cool that he was seeing that. Yeah, that's what's called a chumash, which just means 5. It's got the 5 books of Moses in it. But then there's a accompanying reading from the prophets with every Torah reading every week. So those are in there. And then there's always commentary. In Judaism, you never have scripture alone. It's really weird to find. Well, I actually found one once. I was in a Jewish bookstore somewhere, and I picked up this one. I'm like, this looks different. I opened it up. There's no commentary. It was so bizarre. It like flipped me out. Because you're always engaging scripture with the community throughout time. And so you always have that commentary in there, and along with it.
We saw a commentary once on some passage in one of the major prophets. And I wish I could remember what it was, except that this commentary, this Jewish commentary, said that Christians interpret this to mean this. And I looked at that passage and I thought, I have never in my life heard that interpretation. And it doesn't make sense to me. Where did this commentator get that idea? And I had no idea. I would
Yeah, well,
imagine that there is.
some friends of mine went to a, I think this is years ago, but and it wasn't in Michigan, but they went to a synagogue. They had some, bigwig was in speaking, and they went to it. I think it was actually happening when I was there. We were at a conference or something, and they heard about this, and they went one night, and they came back. They said, "You wouldn't believe the stuff this guy said about Paul." It's like, this is nothing, like Paul was one of the 12. That was one of the things that they said.
Exactly,
And,
yeah.
there's misconceptions that get carried around, on both sides.
Of course,
Again,
I always get nervous when I hear Christians say, "Now Jews believe this."
Yeah.
I always get a little nervous. And I think, "Are you sure?"
Yeah, exactly.
Do you really know?
yeah, exactly.
I know where to go when I want to ask what Jews believe.
Got his email address?
She just calls me 2 a.m. No, she's never done it. Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope you found this to be informative and helpful. Next month, I think I'm going to talk about works, and is it really all bad?
That'd be good. Like works versus grace?
Yeah. So you may tar and feather me afterwards, but I'm going to give you my spiel anyway. Alrighty. Pardon me? The title of the book's called Borderlines, and it's by Daniel Boyarin, Boyarin. My daughter almost studied underneath him. He really wanted her to come out there, and but she thankfully decided to go to Michigan instead. Because he's in Berkeley. I just kept thinking she's going to be way out there in the hinterlands.
Does the book also explore the Messianic Jewish view?
No. I mean, he's sympathetic to Messianic Judaism, but he doesn't engage it a whole lot. I think he even says in his prologue, "I'm not a Messianic Jew. I'm not a Jews for Jesus, but I am a Jew that loves Christians," is how he words it.
So how much of your presentation today was from the book Borderlines, and what percentage would you say?
Probably about 70%. I've mixed in some other material, but I think he did a really good job. I really like Boyarin a lot. I've even heard him speak. He came here to Michigan a few years ago. Really liked him. I don't think he understands Paul at all, but I think he gets Jesus. I think he understands Jesus, but Paul, he takes the typical Jewish line that Paul's the schmuck who started Christianity, and he's the bad guy.
Paul's the bad guy.
Jesus is the Jewish boy who did good, and we can accept him, but Paul's the guy. He's the one that destroyed things by destroying the Torah. But I don't believe that's what Paul was doing, and I think he's misunderstanding what Paul was really all about. Paul's argument was Gentiles don't need to become Jews. So when he says harsh things about the Jewish law, he's not saying it about the Jewish law. He's saying Bobby Joe doesn't have to do that. Eat your bacon, enjoy it, have some on me.
You don't have to become a Jew first to become a Christian.
Right. Yeah. But a lot of people don't get that, and they say Paul was the real creator of Christianity. And
Well, and what Paul has to say about works and faith is going to have to be part of your next talk, am I right?
yes, it will. And what Jesus says about it.
How about James? You're going to throw him in there for good luck?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, James is very direct on this point.
Yeah.
And it tends to get glossed over because it sounds too much like earning your way into heaven. And so,
Catholic.
yeah. So we'll talk about that and
Do we have any Catholics?
see what we come out with it.